Good Sunday afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Southern Oregon Weather Weekend Update. I want to start by recapping the month of April. We'll talk about temperature and precipitation departures from normal. I also want to discuss the system that blew through over the weekend. It dropped some rain on the Rogue Valley and even some snow over the Cascades. We'll get into our 7-day forecast and talk about some teleconnections that are pointing toward quite a bit of warmth for the end of this week. And finally, I want to discuss the latest trends for the month of June. So first, our satellite imagery from NOAA this morning showed clouds hanging around the northern part of the state. Some of this white around Crater Lake is actually snow. And here's the image from the Steele Visitor Center this morning, showing that generally a dusting to an inch fell. Even Willamette Pass and Diamond Lake, a couple thousand feet lower, picked up some snow. But once again, as of 10 a.m., the high May sun angle was already melting the snow on the roads, and the roads had even dried out at Diamond Lake by 10 o'clock this morning. Here is the climate data from Medford for yesterday, Saturday. It felt quite a bit cooler than the temperatures that we've been getting accustomed to for the last few weeks, but that's because temperatures for the last few weeks have been quite a bit above average. The temperature for yesterday at Medford was only 1 degree less than normal for this time of year. So normally we'd be seeing a high of 67, but we've been seeing many days with highs in the 70s and even close to 80. So we've been getting spoiled with some late May and early June weather instead of early May weather. You can see the system also dropped about 0.05 of an inch of rain, but that rainfall wasn't enough to really change our drought situation. I believe the drought monitor, U.S. Drought Monitor, has moved us into a severe drought category. The percent of normal precipitation for the month of April shows that we only received between 25 and 50% of normal rainfall in the Rogue Valley for the month of April, and even less over the Siskiyous. So very dry, and also overall warmer than average for the month of April. I didn't anticipate this. I thought the cool conditions we saw during the first half of the month would continue, and would at least override some of the late month warmth, and give us overall a cooler than average month. That didn't happen. It turned very warm mid-month and late month, and that gave us above average temperatures for the month on the whole. I was correct that the center of the cold would be over the Rockies and the Northern Plains. I just thought it would extend a little bit farther west. So here's the Weather Channel's forecast for the next week. You can see there's a gradual warming trend with a slight interruption on Wednesday, when we could see a very slight chance of showers. But look at the warmth for late week, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So let's look at our teleconnections and the models and see if this forecast is supported by some of our other data. Here's our current 500 millibar map. You can see this big trough in the Gulf of Alaska that's been responsible for our cooler and wetter weather for the last few days. That is gradually going to shift to the west and retreat away from the coast, and this ridge is going to build over our area and give us the warm weather for the end of the week. Meanwhile, the East Coast is going back into the fridge and is going to see some unusually cold air for May for this time of year. So here is the WPC forecast for precipitation over the next 5 days. You can see as that trough retreats farther to the west, we're not going to see really any more substantial chances for rain for a week at least. You can see most of the rain is forecast to fall north of our area into northern Oregon and Washington. But again, that weak system on Wednesday is really only going to give us a chance for some sprinkles at best. The latest trends with this system have been to move it even farther north. Once again, that could change, but at this point, I'm really not expecting more than just some clouds and some cooler air and maybe some showers. Some sprinkles at best. So let's talk about the reasons for this late week warmth. Well, first, you can see this trough is expected to move farther and farther to the west, which allows this ridge to build along the west coast and really become strong by late week. You can also see this blocking starting to develop over Greenland. That's just going to reinforce the trough along the east coast. It's going to get quite chilly there, while we have a taste of summer for the end of this week. So what are the reasons for that? Well, we're currently in phase 4 of the Madden-Julian Oscillation. That lines up very well with the cooler air and the showers that we saw over the weekend. But you can see the European model takes things into phase 5 and then into the null phase, where it's not going to have quite as much of an influence over our weather. And you can see the signal for phase 5 is warmer and drier. There's that ridge building along the west coast with a hint of troughing over the lakes into the northeast. Not perfect, not a perfect match for the ensemble loop that I just showed you, but there are other teleconnections we have to consider, such as the angular momentum. That's supposed to remain positive, according to the CFSV2, over the next week. That does line up very well with the cooler air and the showers we saw over the weekend. However, it doesn't really line up well with the late week warmth we're going to see. And this leads me to believe that we could see a return to slightly cooler conditions after our late week taste of June. We'll get into that in just a bit. We also have our PN8. That definitely is a signal for warmer, even hot weather. You can see the ridge along the west coast, allowing most of the storminess to develop along the east coast, with that blocking over Greenland. Finally, we have our NAO, once again reinforcing that Greenland block when it's negative, reinforcing the storminess along the east coast, and allowing some ridging to develop along the west coast. So, there are some indications that this warmth could only last maybe 4 or 5 days at most, and then we could see some more seasonable weather for the middle of May. You can see this ridge weakens and moves farther north toward Alaska. There's still that strong trough in the east. But look, there's some signals that this troughing could cut underneath the Alaska ridge into the west coast. That lines up well with a positive angular momentum. It also lines up pretty well with MJO phase 2. And if the MJO does loop back through these phases, that would support what the models are showing. This ridge moves farther north toward Alaska and some storminess cuts underneath. How far north this storminess comes, that will depend on how far that ridge moves north. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. Here are the Canadian and the American ensembles at the very end of their forecast range, day 16. This is May 19th now, and you can still see a signal for ridging farther north over Alaska, and even some troughing developing along the west coast. As that angular momentum continues to remain somewhat positive, we'll get into what a negative signal means for June in just a little bit. But the positive signal that we're going to see for the next week, I think, even though that doesn't support our late week warmth, it does support maybe a return to somewhat cooler conditions after that. So yes, what does a negative angular momentum mean for the month of June? Well, this falling AAM leads me to believe that we could start June on a cooler note. I do want to say the trend on the CFSV2 has been to take this less negative. So a week ago, almost all 4 of the members were showing a negative angular momentum for the first week of June. They've moved now a little bit farther toward neutral, but still, that's overall a cooler signal for the start of June. We also have our ENSO region 3.4 cooling. So there's been some subsurface cooler water in the equatorial Pacific that has been gradually rising to the surface and eroding the warmer than normal water at the surface. And this is a sign that we could finally be starting to see a La Nina developing for the fall and for the winter. How quickly this falls remains to be seen, but over the last 10 days, we have definitely seen it take a dip here. And that's also a signal for a cooler start to June. So that was a lot of information, so let's recap it. For April, we did see the core of the cold centered over the Rockies and Northern Plains, as I anticipated, but I didn't predict that the mid-month warmth that we saw in April would skew temperatures to above average on the whole. And we did start April cooler, but finished on a much warmer note. The continued dry conditions that we've been seeing, that's really a mixed signal for the summer fire season. On the one hand, our forests, our mature forests, are quite dry, and so the moisture content in the large fuels is very low, so that's a concern. On the other hand, we haven't been seeing a lot of rain during the spring, so that hasn't led to quite as much growth of ladder fuels like brush and tall grasses. So I would rather have a dry spring and then a cool, wet June than a very wet spring leading to the growth of grass and brush that then completely dries out in a hot and dry June. So I think even though our dry conditions aren't super favorable when it comes to fire weather for the summer, I don't think it's a worst case scenario. For our week ahead, we do have a day or two of warmer weather early in the week, but then some cooler air for Wednesday. Again, I think just a slight chance of showers, maybe some sprinkles at most on Wednesday, but then late in the week, we warm up and get a taste of June. And that's supported definitely by MJO Phase 5 and that positive PNA building the ridge over the west coast. We do have some signs that that ridge weakens and moves north during week 2 as the MJO goes back through phases 2 and 3. And of note, if that MJO rotation continues through phase 4, that's the phase that we just came out of, and that was a cooler and wetter phase. So that could be a sign that we end that we end May on a cooler note going into June. And June itself could be cooler than normal because ENSO region 3.4 is falling. We have some cooler water developing along the equator. And we do have a falling angular momentum. Even though that is trending more toward neutral for June, it was pretty solidly negative a week ago, according to the CFSV2. That's still a cooler signal for June. So guys, thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to set your notifications for the next update that's going to come next weekend. And please leave a like if you enjoyed the forecast for today.